Warning: the following program contains subject matter that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time. Philadelphia, 1959. In the city's aging row house labyrinth, amid the rattle of trolleys and the shrill cries of corner vendors, Harrison Frank Graham entered the world, a child destined for obscurity and eventually infamy. He was born into a working-class black family, the eldest of 5, in a neighborhood that had long ceased to promise social mobility. Poverty was not a spectacle there. It was the oxygen of daily existence. Graham's early years unfolded in a household where chaos and scarcity coexisted. His mother, a disciplinarian tempered by exhaustion, managed the home with rigid order. His father, often transient in his presence, offered structure in fits and absences. The family occupied small apartments along North Philadelphia's neglected streets, where crumbling facades mirrored the quiet attrition of their lives. Teachers at Olney High School later recalled a boy who never quite synchronized with the rhythm of the classroom, a withdrawn adolescent who spoke little, stared often, and seemed adrift even when surrounded by others. Academic reports documented an intellectual impairment, and by the age of 15, he was described as educationally delayed, with a measured IQ that placed him in the range of mild mental disability. The phrase used in early evaluations was slow but compliant. He dropped out before completing 10th grade, not with defiance but with resignation, as if he'd already concluded that the structures of normal life were built for someone else. According to testimony later introduced at trial, his mother had him briefly institutionalized at a mental health facility in the early 1970s, citing emotional instability and unpredictable temper. Records from that period, fragmentary as they are, mention hallucinations, obsessive habits, and a profound detachment from reality. By adolescence, Graham had grown into a tall, wiry youth, physically unremarkable yet curiously memorable. Neighbors described his gait as slow and deliberate, his expression vacant, but never overtly menacing. He swept porches for change, repaired bicycles for neighborhood children, and drifted through North Philly's back streets like a benign ghost. But those who paid closer attention noticed something disquieting. He collected odd things: discarded dolls, broken radios, cracked mirrors, items without worth except to him. He lined them on his window ledge, rearranged them obsessively, sometimes whispering to them. Children teased him for it. Adults dismissed it as eccentricity. In hindsight, it reads as an early symptom of the compulsive disorder and fixation on control that would later metastasize into horror. Family acquaintances remembered that he avoided conflict, but harbored peculiar attachments. To stray cats, to abandoned rooms, to the quiet decay of empty houses. He was drawn to isolation, as though it offered safety. Yet inside that isolation, something dark gestated. An embryonic pathology incubated by mental illness, loneliness, and addiction waiting to take root. By the end of his teenage years, the foundation of Harrison Graham's psyche was already fissured. The cognitive deficits, the untreated psychosis, the social marginalization, all converged into the profile of a man who would one day become Philadelphia's most prolific killer. By the mid-1970s, Harrison Graham had vanished into the cracks of North Philadelphia's urban sprawl. He was barely 16 when he drifted from his mother's apartment, part fugitive, part forgotten. The industrial skeleton of the city had begun to rot. Factories closed, corners filled with dealers, and the streets hummed with the low fever of survival. For Graham, it became both refuge and trap. Neighbors later described him as simple but polite, a man who would do anything for a few dollars or a place to stay. Another recalled, he didn't start trouble, he just always seemed lost, like he was walking in slow motion while the rest of us were running. He took odd jobs, sweeping floors, hauling trash, fixing bicycles. But consistency eluded him. He'd work for weeks, disappear for months, then return gaunt and withdrawn. It was during these disappearances that the first substance dependencies took hold. In interviews, Detectives later pieced together that Graham began snorting heroin and smoking PCP before turning to crack cocaine, a drug that would later define both his life and the depravity of his crimes. The narcotic offered him an escape, a way to quiet the chaos in his head, but each high widened the chasm between his inner world and the one outside. A friend from his early 20s told reporters, "He was never mean, never violent, just slow, like he didn't get how things worked. Once he got high, though, he'd start talking to himself, pacing in circles, arguing with people who weren't there." Court records from his later sentencing confirmed what clinicians had already noted. Graham's addiction was not recreational. It was neurological self-medication, a compulsive attempt to silence psychotic hallucinations and auditory distortions that had begun years earlier. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, Graham gravitated toward the crack dens and abandoned row houses that pockmarked North Philadelphia's decaying grid. These were the places where anonymity was easy, where no one asked questions if you came or went with strangers. It was in these environments that his personality hardened into a paradox, compliant yet controlling, passive yet predatory. He rented cheap rooms, sometimes under false names, and decorated them with the same odd talismans from his youth: dolls, broken electronics, religious posters. Police would later find that even his bedroom in the House of Horrors bore the same pattern, an environment of childlike delusion fused with adult depravity. Former acquaintances said that by 1982, Graham's life had collapsed into full addiction. His hygiene deteriorated, his mental state fractured, and his paranoia deepened. One man who occasionally used drugs with him said, "He'd get high and just stare at the wall. You'd ask what he's doing, and he'd say he was listening to voices telling him not to go outside." Police records show several minor arrests around this period: possession, loitering, disorderly conduct, but none serious enough to flag him as dangerous. Each time, he was released without psychiatric evaluation. Each time, he slipped further into the void. He moved into the north end of 19th Street, a dilapidated building that would later become synonymous with horror. To his landlord, he was a quiet tenant who paid rent in cash. To the residents who occasionally crossed paths with him, he was a harmless addict who spent nights blasting soul records from his window. But behind that door, the line between sanity and monstrosity had already dissolved. Years later, when police interviewed one of his neighbors after his arrest, she said, "We used to hear screams sometimes, but this was North Philly. People argued, people cried. You don't think the man upstairs is keeping bodies." By 1986, Harrison Graham had fully succumbed to addiction, paranoia, and psychosis. His apartment had become a tomb of his own making, a place where drugs, delusion, and death would soon converge. The first official footprints of Harrison Graham in Philadelphia's criminal system appeared almost a decade before the bodies. They were small infractions at first, enough to make a note in a police log, never enough to keep him confined. Between 1975 and 1983, he was cited repeatedly for public intoxication, possession, and disorderly conduct. Each time, the charge dissolved into a brief detention, a signature, and release back into the same broken ecosystem that produced him. A former police officer who later testified in court said, "He wasn't violent, just vacant. You'd see him wandering, hands in pockets, eyes somewhere else. We didn't think he could hurt anyone." That assessment, so ordinary then, would haunt the department years later. Graham's social orbit consisted mostly of addicts, sex workers, and transients who haunted the North 19th Street corridor, a stretch of row houses the city had all but abandoned. He became known as Marty, the quiet tenant who let others crash on his couch in exchange for a hit of crack or a bit of company. One neighbor remembered, "There was always traffic going in and out of that door, women mostly. Sometimes they'd leave screaming, sometimes not at all." Landlords filed complaints about odor and noise, prompting health inspectors to issue citations for unsanitary conditions. Each time officials arrived, Graham met them calmly, deferentially, promising to clean up. The stench, he claimed, came from garbage or spoiled food. Inspectors would leave, unsettled but unconvinced they'd found anything criminal. By 1985, His descent was visible to anyone still looking. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his speech erratic. A friend from the neighborhood later told the Philadelphia Inquirer, "He'd talk about God one minute and demons the next. He said voices were telling him to keep people close, that he couldn't be alone." By 1986, those delusions had become commandments. Harrison Graham had constructed for himself a kingdom of confinement, a single-room realm where he was ruler, savior, and executioner. The warning signs were visible to all who entered, but no one yet understood that behind his door, death had already taken residence. That Sunday morning, after weeks of complaints about the stench, the landlord, Theodore Jackson, arrived with a court order to evict Graham. When Graham refused to answer, Jackson forced open the door with a crowbar. What he found was unspeakable. The air burst outward like a physical force, a wave of rot and death. Jackson staggered back and shouted for help. When patrol officers entered minutes later, they found bodies in every stage of decomposition. One in the bed, one in a closet, one slumped behind a door, others beneath debris and blankets. Detective Charles Boyle, who arrived on scene, later told reporters, "There were bones in corners, torsos on the floor, and one skeleton propped against the wall. It looked like they had been there for months, maybe a year." Forensic specialists from the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office determined that the victims had been killed between 1986 and 1987. Several were strangled with cloth ligatures, others asphyxiated manually. High levels of cocaine were found in most of the remains, indicating that the victims had been using drugs shortly before death. Amid the debris, investigators recovered a baby doll, its limbs missing, a relic Graham reportedly kept for company. The juxtaposition of that child's toy and the bodies it overlooked would become one of the most haunting images in Philadelphia's criminal history. The victim profiles and forensic findings were as followed. Mary Jeter, age 36. Last seen alive in late 1986 entering Graham's apartment. She was discovered wrapped in a bed sheet, her remains skeletal. Ligature impressions on the cervical vertebrae confirmed strangulation. She was known locally as Mary Lou, a habitual crack user. Friends said she trusted Graham because he was gentle and never violent. Robin Deschazor, age 27. Reported missing by family 6 months before the discovery. Found at the foot of Graham's bed, partially clothed. Toxicology revealed lethal cocaine levels. The coroner ruled death by asphyxia. Detectives concluded she was killed during a drug binge. Barbara Mahoney, age 33. Found in the living room corner beneath debris, fully mummified. Her death likely occurred in 1986. Her identification was confirmed through dental records. Police theorized she was one of the earliest victims. Cynthia Brooke, age 26, located inside a closet, still wearing fragments of clothing. Fingerprint analysis matched a prior arrest record. Officers later referred to that closet as the chamber, describing the floor as cement-like with congealed body fluids. Valerie Jamison, age 24, remains recovered behind a pile of garbage bags near the rear wall. Her hair was still braided, suggesting more recent death. Cause of death: manual strangulation. Sandra Garvin, age 33, and Patricia Franklin, age 26. Police later determined that Graham's victims were sex workers and addicts who frequented the same neighborhood. Most were acquaintances, women he had known for weeks or months. He offered drugs or shelter in exchange for sex. Once inside, his psychosis dictated ritual: drugs, paranoia, control, and then death. Assistant District Attorney Roger King later said, "He killed people he thought couldn't leave him. It wasn't rage, it was delusion." Forensic psychologists described his behavior as psychosexual compulsion, entwined with dependency disorder. A man whose fear of abandonment converged with hallucination. He kept the bodies because he couldn't face solitude. He told detectives later, "They were company. I didn't want to be by myself." The press descended on 1631 North 19th Street within hours. Reporters described detectives wearing masks as they carried out skeletal remains in plastic bags. Crowds gathered behind yellow tape. One headline read, "Bodies found in crack den, tenant missing." Captain James O'Brien of the Philadelphia Homicide Unit told the media, This is the most gruesome crime scene I've seen in my career. We believe the suspect may have been living with the bodies for months. The discovery sparked immediate panic across North Philadelphia. Women in the area formed groups to walk together at night. Residents gathered outside the taped-off building, whispering the same word over and over: monster. The discovery at 1631 North 19th Street on August 9, 1987, detonated through Philadelphia like a shockwave. By noon that day, homicide detectives had already traced the unit to a single tenant. Harrison Frank Graham, 32 years old, unemployed, and last seen wandering the block carrying a small suitcase and a Bible. Detective Charles Boyle told reporters, "When we found that apartment, we expected a homicide, not 7. The question wasn't just where he was, but how he'd lived like that without anyone stopping him." As the coroner's vans pulled away, Graham had already disappeared into the sprawl of North Philadelphia. Witnesses last saw him leaving the house around 8:30 a.m., hours before the landlord broke in. He carried a white plastic bag, a portable radio, and wore a stained t-shirt. A neighbor, Ernestine Williams, later told the Inquirer, "He looked calm, said he was going to his mother's. I asked about the smell and he just smiled and said, 'It's taken care of.'" Police immediately issued a citywide bulletin. Flyers with his mugshot appeared on poles, in storefronts, at shelters, and halfway houses. Captain James O'Brien described him as possibly delusional, dangerous if cornered. Officers combed through abandoned row houses and vacant lots in North Philly's 19th Street corridor, searching for any sign of him. Detectives also learned that Graham collected disability payments under his real name. That detail narrowed their search. He would need to collect his next check soon. It became the anchor of the investigation. They would wait for him to come to the money. Within 24 hours, the case dominated every local broadcast. Newscasters stood outside the sealed building as workers hauled out debris. The Philadelphia Daily News ran the headline, "The stench of death, 7 bodies in North Philly apartment." Residents gathered behind the barricades, some weeping, some shouting at police to burn the building down. Rumors spread that there were more victims, that he'd fled to New Jersey, that he'd been seen preaching on a street corner quoting scripture. The Homicide Division coordinated with the FBI Fugitive Task Force, but Graham was no master criminal. He was an addict with nowhere to hide. For 3 days, he drifted through North Philadelphia's vacant lots and alleyways, sleeping behind abandoned buildings, scavenging for food. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing him at a corner near Ridge Avenue, talking to himself, clutching a Bible. One man told reporters he looked scared more than anything, like a kid who knew he was in trouble. On August 13, 1987, police received a call from Harrison Graham's mother, Lillian Graham, who said her son had contacted her by phone. She told them, "He wants to turn himself in. He says he didn't kill nobody, he just lived there with them." Detectives set up a meeting at her apartment on 30th Street near Allegheny Avenue. They surrounded the building quietly that afternoon. At approximately 3 p.m., Harrison Graham walked out of his mother's apartment holding a Bible above his head. He was barefoot, trembling, and muttering scripture. Witnesses heard him say, "I'm giving myself to God." Detective Boyle later recalled, "He didn't resist. He looked confused, almost relieved. He said he hadn't killed anyone, that the women just died while they were with him." As officers cuffed him, he reportedly asked, "Can I keep my Bible?" They allowed it. When placed in the back of a police cruiser, Graham looked out the window and whispered to a reporter, "I didn't kill those women. I loved them." He was booked at Philadelphia Police, Headquarters Homicide Division, under charges of multiple murder pending autopsy confirmation. Forensic teams were still processing evidence from 1631 North 19th Street, but the city had its monster in custody, a soft-spoken addict who claimed companionship, not carnage. Assistant District Attorney Roger King told the press, "What we have here is a man who lived among corpses. Whether he killed them or not, that's for the evidence to prove, but no sane person does what he did." As the doors to the interrogation room closed, Harrison Graham began to talk. He sat in interview room 4 of Philadelphia Police Headquarters, a small, windowless chamber where the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A tape recorder clicked on at 7:42 p.m., August 13th, 1987. Across the table sat detectives Charles Boyle and William Shelton. Harrison Graham's wrists were cuffed loosely in front of him. His Bible rested on the table, its pages frayed at the edges. He looked dazed but calm. When asked if he understood why he'd been brought in, he nodded and said softly, "'Cause they found them ladies." Detective Boyle replied, "That's right. We need you to tell us how they got there." Graham blinked slowly and said, "They died on me. They just died. I didn't hurt them. I was with them, and then they wasn't breathing no more." He rocked slightly as he spoke, his voice flat, almost mechanical. He told detectives he had invited the women into his apartment to party, that they smoked crack and sometimes had sex, and that afterward they would fall asleep and never wake up. "I got scared," he said, "so I put them over in the corner till I could think what to do. Then I got high again and forgot." The detectives pressed harder. Boyle asked, "Did you strangle them?" Graham hesitated, scratching his arm. "Maybe one or two. They was fighting me, trying to leave, but I didn't mean to. They was my friends." At several points he broke into erratic tangents, quoting the Bible, repeating verses from the book of Revelation. "God said don't let them go," he muttered. "He said they was my company. I couldn't be alone again." For more than 4 hours, the detectives alternated between gentle questioning and confrontation. They showed him photographs of the crime scene, the bed, the closet, the decayed bodies. When shown the image of Mary Jeter, he looked down and said quietly, "She liked to dance to the radio. I didn't want her to go." When asked about the closet where multiple bodies were found, he said, "That's where they slept when the smell got too bad. I just closed the door. I didn't know what else to do." Detectives noted that throughout the interrogation, Graham displayed no anger, no fear, and no recognition of the horror. Psychiatric evaluators later described his demeanor as profoundly disassociated. One doctor testified that Graham exhibited a blunted affect consistent with chronic psychosis and possible schizophrenia, exacerbated by long-term cocaine intoxication. Detective Shelton recalled later, "He didn't have the mind of a killer. He had the mind of a child who didn't understand death. That's what made it so disturbing." By midnight, the questioning had yielded a chilling sequence of admissions. He acknowledged being present when each woman died. He admitted to putting his hands around a few of their necks during arguments. He confessed to keeping them around because they made the voices quiet. In one of the taped exchanges, Boyle asked, "Why didn't you call for help?" Graham replied, "'Cause they'd take me away. And then who would I talk to?" When detectives finally asked if he understood that what he had done was wrong, he responded, "It ain't wrong if you love 'em. I didn't kill nobody, I just didn't let 'em go." After the statement was signed, Boyle turned off the recorder. He told the press later, "I've interviewed killers, rapists, everything you can name, but I've never sat across from someone so lost." He truly didn't grasp what he'd done. Graham was transported to Philadelphia Detention Center under suicide watch. Within days, he was examined by Dr. Clancy McKenzie, a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with chronic paranoid schizophrenia, coupled with cocaine-induced psychosis and borderline intellectual functioning. In court testimony, Dr. McKenzie stated, "Mr. Graham operated under a delusional belief that these women were part of his family. His actions stemmed from an inability to distinguish between life, death, and companionship." Despite his obvious impairments, prosecutors saw the confession as voluntary and legally sound. Assistant DA Roger King later said, "He was coherent. He understood the questions. He just didn't comprehend humanity." When the detectives left the room, Graham asked for his Bible. He began to hum softly, a hymn his mother had taught him as a child. The camera in the corner of the room recorded him singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know." His voice faded into silence as the tape ran out. On September 26, 1988, more than a year after his arrest, Harrison Frank Graham entered courtroom 304 of the Criminal Justice Center in Philadelphia. He wore a loose beige prison jumpsuit and carried, as always, a Bible pressed to his chest. The trial would last 3 weeks, a grim spectacle of forensic testimony, psychiatric debate, and photographs that left jurors in silent disbelief. Reporters filled every bench. Outside, crowds gathered behind metal barricades, some holding signs that read, "Justice for the Seven." The city that had once ignored the smell from 1631 North 19th Street now demanded retribution for the horror it had overlooked. Judge Robert Latrone presided. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Roger King, a veteran of Philadelphia's homicide unit, known for his precision and restraint. The defense, court-appointed, was led by attorney Mark Gottlieb, who entered an initial plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. From the outset, the prosecution presented Graham not as a calculating killer, but as something more chilling. A man who killed without malice, without conscience, and without comprehension. Yet, they argued, his understanding of concealment proved he knew right from wrong. Assistant D.A. King stood before the jury and said, "He didn't turn himself in after the first death. He didn't call for help after the second or the third. He hid them, he lived with them, and when the smell became unbearable, he nailed the door shut and walked away. That is not insanity, that is awareness." The state introduced photographs of the apartment, the stained mattress, the closet filled with skeletal remains, the empty baby doll. Jurors covered their mouths as each image was displayed. The medical examiner testified that several victims had been killed in similar ways, manual strangulation, and that all deaths had occurred under controlled conditions inside the apartment. Detective Charles Boyle, recalling his interrogation, told the court, "He said they just died, but he also said he put his hands around their necks because they were trying to leave. That's intent. That's choice." The prosecution closed its case by calling Graham's behavior a slow-motion genocide against the forgotten women of North Philadelphia. The defense countered with a portrait of a man consumed by madness and intellectual limitation. Attorney Gottlieb described Graham as a schizophrenic with the mind of a child, incapable of grasping the concept of death, let alone premeditation. Expert witness Dr. Clancy McKenzie, the psychiatrist who had examined Graham after his arrest, testified, "Mr. Graham functioned at the emotional level of an 8-year-old. He perceived these women not as victims, but as companions who left him when they died. His delusion compelled him to keep them near so he would not be alone." When asked whether Graham understood right from wrong, Dr. McKenzie paused and said, "He understood consequences, not morality. He knew the police would come, but he didn't understand why they would call it murder." The defense argued that the state's witnesses had misinterpreted Graham's confession, and that his flat affect, his lack of emotional reaction, was symptomatic of psychotic detachment, not callousness. Gottlieb told the jury, "This is not evil. This is illness left untreated, festering in poverty and neglect until it became tragedy." On October 26, 1988, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of abuse of a corpse. Graham showed no reaction. He held his Bible and stared at the floor. When asked by the judge if he wished to make a statement, he said softly, "I'm sorry they died. I didn't mean it that way, I just wanted them to stay." The courtroom remained silent as the judge ordered the penalty phase to begin. On November 1st, 1988, the jury returned its decision, death by lethal injection. When the sentence was read, Graham clutched his Bible and whispered, "God will forgive me before you do." His mother, seated in the front row, wept openly, repeating, "He's sick, he's not evil." Judge Latrone turned to her and said quietly, "Ma'am, I believe you, but the law cannot." 2 years later, on September 15, 1994, the death penalty was vacated and commuted to life imprisonment without parole. The decision cited constitutional concerns about executing a defendant whose mental state rendered him unable to rationally appreciate the nature of his punishment. After the verdict, Harrison Frank Graham was processed through the Philadelphia Detention Center before being transferred to State Correctional Institution Graterford, then later to SCI Crescent, a facility equipped for inmates with psychiatric disorders. The transition from courtroom spectacle to institutional silence was immediate. Guards described him as polite, almost childlike, but increasingly detached from reality. One corrections officer later recalled, he'd sit on his bunk reading that same Bible for hours. Sometimes he'd talk to the air like someone was answering back. Medical logs from Cresson documented recurring psychotic episodes, auditory hallucinations, and compulsive rituals of cleaning and arranging objects. Behaviors eerily reminiscent of his compulsions inside 1631 North 19th Street. He rarely interacted with other inmates. He refused television but requested gospel radio, telling a chaplain, "I still hear them sometimes. The ladies. But they ain't mad no more." Philadelphia never officially memorialized the 7 women. Their deaths became a footnote, another statistic in the violent decade that devoured the city's poor and addicted. Detective Boyle, long since retired, visited the empty lot once in the late 1990s. He told a reporter, "People drive by that corner every day. They don't know what was there. Maybe that's for the best." But for the few who still remembered, the surviving relatives, the detectives, the social workers, the name Harrison Graham became shorthand for something larger. The cost of apathy, the thin line between illness and evil, and the city's failure to see the monsters it creates.